what I want to kind of go through today, right, is we've seen a lot of, especially lately, right, over the last couple of years, particularly, D&I have been all the buzzwords, right? We have seen unfortunate incidents of Black lives being taken, right, pointlessly, and it wrestles with us from a country standpoint, like just how are we holding these things, right, as a country, and we have to just talk about the impacts. And then we've seen tons of organizations make statements, right, outwardly about racial justice and social justice and what they believe to be their parts, right, in this work as a culture, as a society, as a whole. But then we often sometimes, right, see that it falls short. These initiatives, these efforts fall short and ultimately don't succeed because there's core things that are not at place, right? There's not a core understanding and foundation of what it means for an organization and really what people's roles are in this work. And so hopefully today we'll talk a little about what some of that looks like. So I want to create some foundation of common language. I think language is super critical in this work. And oftentimes we're not using the right words, right? We're saying things which mean something completely different. And oftentimes, right, each of us starts at a different place. And so that foundation of language is super critical to be able to move collectively as a whole. Want to talk about how you're able to see and point out where some of this shows up, right? As we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'll also talk a little about why we specifically talk about racial equity and not explicitly call out, right, the D&I part of it. But we're going to talk about how we build some of that awareness and analysis to identifying where and how this shows up in our organizations. For many of you, I always recognize that organizations are in very different places, right? When we work with our clients, we find that no one starts from the same exact spot. Everyone has a different starting point. And so I think it's really critical to be very explicit, open, and honest with yourselves as you lean into this work. Like, where do we need to start? And so we're going to talk a little about how to be able to identify kind of that starting point for you all. Infrastructure is super critical. Oftentimes, we do not hold this work at the same critical organizational functional level, right, as other kind of critical functions within organizations, such as human resources, such as legal, such as finance, right? I'm going to make an argument and talk to you all about why this needs to be elevated to that level for it to be successful, what that means from an infrastructure standpoint. And then we'll just do a quick wrap up. If you've got questions and comments, would love to be able to, again, interact with you as we go through the day. It's critical, though, before I dive into the work, that we do a land acknowledgement. I think this is really critical, especially as we talk about this particular aspect of the work. Why? Because we've got to talk about the first step in this is about healing. It's about truth telling. This nation, this society, right, has harmed many people through settler colonialism and genocide, through stolen land and stolen people. And so for ONG, our company, and myself, we choose to acknowledge the truth, right? The harm, the trauma, the genocide, the violence that has occurred. I want to take an opportunity to honor the lands that sustain me and the first people of those lands. So particularly I'm based in the Charlotte area, so I want to honor the land of the Catawba and Waxhaw nations. I was born and raised in New York, as Zach said, so I want to honor the Matineca Nation land in New York City. Again, these are the individuals, right? And so that were on this land before us. And so for us, it's about supporting the sovereignty and land reclamation of these peoples from whom the land was stolen. And it's important to tell that story because we've got to learn about and acknowledge what has been done, what is currently impacting Indigenous people, and how you can influence healing and reconciliation no matter where you are, whether that be an organization, right, or in society in general. I think it's always important to acknowledge this, again, because of the history that is ingrained and embedded and is part of who we are as a country. And you can visit that link, no matter where you are, right? You put in where you're located, and it'll actually bring up the nations and peoples, right, that occupied that land before us. And so if you want to throw it in the chat box, would love to see where some folks are at, right? And acknowledge what nations or lands you might be on right now. A little quickly about who we are. ONG Racial Equity Collaborative, we're 100% minority women-owned business. We're a small consulting firm that works with a number of consulting partners as well. And really, our work is focused on what we call practice, right? We consider ourselves practitioners in racial equity. And really, what our focus is working with our clients to do organizational change work. Being able to apply a racial equity lens that is intended to dismantle structural and institutional racism through policy, procedure, and practice, recognizing that we operate in rules, right, in structures set up by these policies, procedures, and practices. And so we can create ultimately different outcomes by addressing those, by shifting those so that they actually do indeed truly work for all, right, which transforms outcomes. So it's a little about who is, and then shout out to my partners who are not with me today, but Bernadette and Kimberly, again, couldn't do this work without them. So we're foodie folks before we dive into the content. We include food in every single aspect of our conversations and our trainings. And so I'm just curious to hear from you all in the comment box. You know, what's a favorite food that you're looking for entering the fall? I can't believe it's like the end of the summer. But let us know, put in the chat box, what are some favorite foods that you're looking forward to as we approach the fall? And I'm gonna read those out if I see those in the chat box, but we'll keep going just for sake of time. So we got some learning and practice agreements, right? So as we go throughout today, oh, pumpkin anything, I see. Yep, I hear that, pumpkin anything. As we go through today, there are a few things I want you all to keep in mind, right, as we go through this. And part of this is because, like you said, we consider ourselves practitioners, right? There's a learning aspect to this work, but there's also a practice aspect to this work. We can't just learn about diversity, inclusion, and racial equity, right? We've got to practice these things. And as we go through the content that I want you all to be constantly thinking about these particular learning and practice agreements and see how you might be able to carry these even past this particular session, right? Asking questions. How can you have both and thinking? Impact is really centering that impact is greater than intent. How can we constantly practice and build the muscle of doing racial equity work, right? How do we start to build that into our daily practice? How can we be accountable to this work, not just internally, but externally, right? Particularly, I'm going to talk about centering those most impacted, right? How do we maintain that accountability? Lean into the discomfort. This is a very sometimes uncomfortable conversation because it will have you wrestling with things, right? Both internally and structurally, and asking the question, but like, why do we do this? And what outcomes it creates. Accept and expect lack of closure. I love this because it's really just speaks to we're not going to solve everything today. And so we've got to accept that, right? And just, but allows us to continue to keep moving on. And then use I statements. We can talk about other people's experiences, but what is your experience? Because this perspective is really what that's grounded in as we kind of lean into this work. So I saw soup, tacos, always tacos. Pumpkin soup, absolutely. I feel like tacos is like always a thing. So I hear you, Angie, always tacos. I appreciate y'all for sharing. I'm looking forward to just like good roasted stuff in the oven around the Thanksgiving time, particularly some of my wife's cooking. She hits it on the head. All right, cool. Let's go into some of that level setting that I wanted to do, right? Talk about that foundation that's really critical, particularly to think about language. When we talk about language, these two words are oftenly used, right? Oftenly used interchangeably. Folks use equality, right? Trying to mean equity, and they're very distinct words meaning very different things. And so when we talk about embedding this work, and right, we want to say our organization wants to make Black Lives Matter. We want to lean into diversity and inclusion efforts, right? We've got to be really explicit and careful about the language we're using, because that language will determine and ultimately guide how we create policy, how we create procedure and practice, because it will lead ultimately towards intent, right? If I'm saying I'm trying to achieve equality, that means I'm trying to achieve sameness. And we recognize in some of this graphic, right, that sameness is not always what works. That still creates disparities, right, as we see about lived outcomes. And so we've got to be really, right, again, careful about the language we use, because if we're trying to shoot for equality, right, that's going to get us a particular result. Now, for equity, right, that's about justice. That's about recognizing that we're all haven't started off in the same place, that we're trying to achieve fairness. And right, particularly as we think about like resources, opportunities, again, kind of the structural, institutional stuff that exists that allows people to thrive, right? So I'll talk a little more about this, but again, I think I want to make the distinction between the two. And I think this graphic, right, helps explain, because it shows people get what they need rather than thinking they're kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And so that's the core difference between this. And as we think about D&I efforts, oftentimes those D&I efforts are centering around equality. And equality, again, will still lead to seeing disparate impacts for certain groups. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to be able to identify what those are. These are just another two other graphics that I like around equality versus equity. And so you'll see both of these, right? The one on the right, I think it also helps us speak towards, right, different abilities and recognizing that equity is not just, does not just create itself, right, within just the racial ethnic paradigm alone. There is a multitude of intersectionalities that exist, right, within people that create equality, right, that where we can achieve equality and equity depending on, right, who that individual is and the subsets of like their abilities, what their makeup is, right, all those different identifying factors. So these are just two other pictures that I like to, for your kind of reference. DEI, right? We like to break this down because we really do believe it to be a spectrum. We explicitly focus on racial equity because we believe it actually incorporates, it encompasses diversity inclusion. Diversity inclusion is, right, is what you see here. It's about the quantity and the quality. It's about representation mostly, right? Where we're talking about the makeup of a particular group where, you know, we need to diversify, either to be trained, but right, whether that be train of thought, whether that be racial or ethnic diversity, would that be other intersectionalities, right, into a group that brings different perspectives. The quality, the number, the inclusion part, right, is that quantitative aspect of it. It really becomes the amount. It becomes who becomes involved and is participating in pieces. The challenge with that is, right, I think this is one of the pieces that where we think we lean into, that we're trying to get organizations to lean more into, is that equity is about then those policies, procedures, and practices that drive outcomes, right? Diversity and inclusion is not necessarily going to drive outcomes by themselves. It is then those, because you could bring in, right, more people of color, you could bring in more other, right, put whatever intersectionality you want into your organization, but your policies, your procedures, or practices may not be working for them, right? You're bringing folks potentially into harmful, toxic environments. You're bringing them into spaces, right, where those policies, procedures, and practices historically, right, and traditionally do not work for them. Because, and I'm going to talk a little about this, right, all of our organizations, if you are founded and grouped in the United States, right, have a particular foundation by which we kind of adopt, right, de facto of the kind of the country's history, right, and how it holds this work. And that means, you know, ultimately, we're building on a foundation of white supremacy system culture, right? And so we've got to transform the policies, procedures, and practices, because those are the things that will ultimately guide right, outcomes and results. It's super critical and super important to have diversity and be inclusive in your environment. But again, you could, all of your policies, your procedures, and practices could actually be doing harm to those people that you're bringing into the space, right? So again, I think that's something that's super critical. We're really focused on having folks focus on the structural and institutional rather than the interpersonal. I think oftentimes we talk about racism from an interpersonal standpoint. When we recognize that this is a system, that it's built to create rules and right and structures that allow one group to benefit and thrive over others, that's the piece that we've got to dismantle and start to break up. And so this is why we lead with race, right? We see in the data time and time again, race is the #1 predictor for one's outcomes, right? And we can see this across a multitude of examples. I mean, these are just three. We can dive into the business world and think about, right, again, why D&I efforts exist in terms of like who's at the leadership level, right? Where other folks rest in organizations. When people think about, I think about procurement really often, right, outside of where one of the areas where this work can be done, right? Money, where is money flowing to? So we think about how much you're contracting, right, your procurement process. That is just another example of where we see race leading, and we constantly see, right, Black, Indigenous, and people of color unfortunately falling and experiencing some of the worst outcomes. And so it's critical that we lead with race because again, it is the #1 predictor for one's success. And then we lean on, right, all the other intersectionalities. One of the examples I always say is we actually can't achieve gender equity, right, without leading with race, because then we're really only talking about white women doing better. right? When we lead with race explicitly, the data will show us, right? Yes, white women get paid less than white men on average, but then if we look at the data even closer, we're finding that Black, Indigenous, and women of color are faring even worse, right? They're getting even less on the dollar, right, compared to white and or Black male, right, counterparts. And so it's, again, it's critical that we be able to kind of lead with that piece of the work as we go kind of dive into this. Defining racism, I think, is also really super critical, right, as we do this work, because oftentimes we're talking of, again, people want to use the language of D&I and they want to do all these initiatives, and I think it comes from a place of good intent. The problem is, right, if we don't have the knowledge base, we could actually do more harm. Right? We could be trying to achieve something and accomplish something, but not really fully understand what we're trying to change. And that's why this knowledge base is so critical to the organizational work, right, that is focused on racial equity and centering it. The power of systems is critical, right? Being able to understand what institutional racism is, I think, really important as you look at your organizations and think about, well, where can this efforts fit in, right? Where can we start to do this work? This is particularly as we think about, again, like those policies, procedures, and practices, right, that create these different outcomes for different groups. Institutions, right, really, I think, never mention any racial gaps, but efforts to create these advantages, right, this is where it exists inherently. And again, these institutions have been built for generations. I often say, people say, oh, the system is broken. The system is not broken, y'all. It works exactly the way it was intended and designed to, right? And that's an important perspective to have, because if we're trying to say it's broken and trying to fix it, right, you can't fix what's not broken. We've actually got to acknowledge that and then be able to transform it. The systemic and structural side of it, right, is really the thinking through the normalization and legitimization of kind of the historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, right, that has routinely and consistently advantages white people, right, over people of color. This is where we talk about the structure itself, right? It is all the rules, it is all the systems and the organizations, all of this, again, operating collectively, right, to create outcomes. And so we've got to think about it. It's profound and it's pervasive, and it's sometimes really hard to identify, especially now because it's not race, right, or ethnic explicit. And so we've got to be able to dig through and think about how the differing layers and levels of power, whether perceived or real, are impacting and affecting outcomes. And so this is part of the unpacking that each of us has to do as we think about our own organizational work. The culture and values, and you know, I know CultureCon talks a lot about, right, like the culture piece of organization and how culture determines outcomes. Really, your culture is, right, represents for us your values, and your values represent your culture, right? They're an interchangeable set. And part of that is because we're really focused on the operationalizing. How do we implement this work? How do we operationalize the values by which we set as an organization? And some of that is really being able to do kind of these, like, really look at these three kind of pieces for us, right? How can you set a vision? How can you be really explicit about identifying what your organization hopes to achieve, the impact that it hopes to have? Then knowing your impact. This is a space where we believe in data. Data is super critical, particularly though you've got to get data that is disaggregated, or we could say at least by race, ethnicity, gender, and geography, right? Where you can have that data. It's critical because that's going to tell you where some of the, right, where the shortfalls are happening, where the negative impact is occurring, and then impact over intent. And this last piece around intentional infrastructure. Again, I said this earlier, we're really big advocates for elevating this work. We have to start treating diversity, equity, and inclusion as a critical organizational function, the same way we do our legal counsel, the same way we do our finance, right, and CFO, right, our finance structures, the same way we look at our, you know, any other major, right, legal structures that we have in the organization. We've got to elevate it to that critical level, because it's not about just working it into the organization. It's embedded and has to be interwoven into every aspect of our organization, right? It can't just be an add-on, because what's going to happen is There are always going to be those policies, procedures, and practices, right, that are going to create those negative outcomes. And so we've got to be able to unpack it. It's really like peeling back an onion, right, layer by layer. And so again, as we go through these things, it allows us to be really clear about what our values are, right? And help us to start to then, like, again, operationalize this in a way that determines and drives the culture of the organization. It is one thing to say that Black Lives Matter, right? And that we're an organization that is diverse, right, and inclusive. But when the data tells us otherwise, right, if we look at all the different outcomes, then there's a reconciling there that has to come. And this is where, again, we get back to, do your values actually line up with your culture? And when I say culture, I want you to think about like the operationalized culture, right? What is actually happening and what your organization is living day in and day out. And that culture shift really needs what we call centering those most impacted. When you use the data, the disaggregated data, right, you're going to see where the disparities exist. And that's critical, because when you see where these disparities exist, it is going to allow you to identify those subpopulations, right, where something is happening, where a policy, a procedure, or a practice could be leading to that negative outcome. This helps us to really focus in, right, and understand what the root causes are to that outcome with this particular body of folks. And again, we lead with race, but this is where any other intersectionalities, right, can kind of surface themselves. We'll talk a little about the white supremacy systems culture, right? This is a critical piece because, and there's a resource that I'll share with you at the end of this from an organization that helps to identify what some of those things look like, how it shows up in an organization. That awareness is critical, right? Even things like sense of urgency, worship to the written word, paternalism. These are things that show up in the culture, show up in how it gets operationalized. This is where the disruption has to happen, right? Because these things end up becoming what ultimately create that differing impact and outcome. We've got to be aware of those components. We've got to think about the drivers of those components. And what I love about the resource that I'll share with you at the end is that it has antidotes, right? Areas that you can begin to start in to think to how you can change those outcomes. And again, this document is intended to be like a starter point, right? It really helps us. Our organization uses it all the time, daily. And it's a practice, right? We go in, we ask ourselves questions, and then we keep peeling back the onion. And then we find that as we get deeper and deeper, right, it helps us to get to some of the root causes. And again, helps to drive how we develop our policies, our practices and procedures as an organization. When you're creating a vision for you all, as you think, right, as you lean into D&I efforts, and I'm curious to hear from you all, like where you are in your DEI journey within your organization. Right? Are you just starting? Have you been doing some work? So please, in the chat box, let me know like where you are exactly in your kind of journey, because I'm curious to hear. When you set a vision for this work, right, there are some critical questions as we ask ourselves, like, what do we value? What do we as an organization hope to achieve and hope to contribute to society as a whole? And I think that's the other pieces, right? There is some larger contribution that we've got to start to wrap our heads around, that it's not just us within an organization, right? Our organizations do ultimately impact society more broadly, whether that be through, right, direct commerce, whether that be through services, right, or other aspects of like your interactions with the larger, broader environment in society. We're still having impact on that. And so as we lean into this work, you got to ask yourself again, this kind of big question of like, what impact are we hoping to have? Is it really that we're just trying to have more people of color in the organization, right? Do we just want more people of color at the table? Like, what's the impact that we're hoping to create and drive as a result of that? That vision is super critical, because that's going to be your North Star. It helps you think about and guides what your actions are going to be, right? What you are going to lean into next, how we make pivots as an organization. Our organization, right, says that if we're committed to the liberation of all people, that we want to see people, right, inherently own their own, right, their own impacts and outcomes. When we make decisions as a, right, from even consultants that we contract with, right, our consultant contract has to represent that. It has to reflect that, right? In ownership of materials, in how we pay those individuals, how soon we pay those individuals, right? What that turnaround looks like. What allows for shared power and decision making, right, within that contract. It's hard work, because then we have to lean in and ask questions about the language that's in there. Says, hey, what impact is this creating, right? Is this aligning with, again, our values as an organization? Does this, are we creating the impact that we're saying we want to create, right? So that is, again, it's a really critical skill and exercise that we've got to be really explicit. And I would also offer too, right, if you're leaning into these DEI efforts, when you're having this vision setting conversation, be explicit about race and ethnicity, right? Gender, geography, the other intersectionalities, because when you're explicit about it, that's when you're kind of calling it out to power, right? You're calling it out to everybody publicly so that you can all be held accountable to then the shifting those outcomes and those impacts down the road. And this is why we say impact over intent, right? Because once you have that vision, all your actions, right, should be driving towards achieving what you're hoping to call, right, what you've called out in your vision. To do that, you've got to be really, really, really like focused, and I would say disciplined, right, around impact over intent. Because intent can be great, but again, you could be creating negative impacts. And so one of the ways that we work with organizations as a skill set to really hone in and make sure that, right, we're achieving the impact that we hope and desire is about really like, how do we lean into data? How do we use that to be a powerful measure with us internally and externally to tell us like where we are on our journey? And again, disaggregating that by race, ethnicity, gender, and geography at the very minimum, if you can. And if your organization is not doing that outside of like just HR, because I'm going to talk about that. This is not just an HR effort either, y'all. This is every single aspect of your organization. This is how you think about, yes, HR components of like hiring and recruitment, right? But also your pay levels, right? Your promotion policies. But even on a programmatic side, again, I think about finance a lot oftentimes, right? I think about contracting and procurement. Where is your money going? Are you being intentional about how you're being inclusive and diverse with with your procurement streams? There are so many different aspects of this work that we can unpack and see where we are driving impact, particularly as we think about, right, racial inequities. And so if we want to say, again, this organization is committed to Black Lives Matter, right, or other social justice and social impact efforts, then we've got to be really explicit about how our organization is impacting those groups, right? And data is going to tell us how we're doing. It's going to allow us to be able to help to measure our impact. Quantitative data also, I want to be really clear, is not the end all be all, right? It helps to show us like number wise, right, where we might be at a particular time and point. But it's also really critical that we have qualitative data, right? Data, conversations, and relationship with those most negatively impacted. So we're having engagements and conversation, right, with those that we're seeing the negative impacts, where we're seeing those policies, procedures, and practices negatively impacting people. Because that data, right, their understanding, their perspective about where root causes and those issues exist, we need that info. We need that insight. That is super critical data to help us think about how we can, again, center this impact over intent. Because again, right, we can have folks, some of the smartest people at DOE, right, but have never set foot in a given community. And they're coming up with policies that are ultimately going to impact these families. But if you don't, you might be missing something, right, on the ground level that you're not going to see in the quantitative data, which is why we've got to be able to have that kind of, right, that engagement, that qualitative data to help us determine what those strategies and interventions are going to be to that, right, that allow us to kind of transform that impact. Action for change in the infrastructure. This is the piece where I said earlier, I think as a tool and as a practice for each of you, I think is super critical. This can't be a 1 or 2 person effort, right? It can't be 100% volunteer. Whether you are a 4-person size organization to 2,500 or 20,000, right? If you're doing it on a volunteer basis and you're asking people, right, to add something on to their everyday work, we all wear a lot of hats, no matter how big your organization is. Folks are stretched daily. Why would we give something of this magnitude and importance, right, only a part-time focus and approach? That sets people up to fail. Why? Because now we then have unrealistic expectations of what these individuals can hopefully change and create right within organizations. And then we're also not giving them the resources that they need to do this work, whether that be the capacity building, whether that be the knowledge building, whether that be the technical support, right, as they move through this, or even the human capital support, right, as we move through this. Again, we wouldn't tell a CFO, right, that they didn't need what they needed, that we weren't going to get them the resources or the systems that they need for our organization to be fiscally sound and thriving. We wouldn't do that of legal, right? These are, again, critical organizational functions that we see as critical to our success. The argument here is this has to take that same level of approach, because that work is, we need dedicated staff, dedicated expertise to work with others in the organization to really embed this work, to help unpack all the different areas that it, right, where we see racial disparities, where we see structural and institutional racism. And again, we're not going to see it explicitly, right? It's all, we don't live in a race explicit world when it comes to, right, discriminatory practices. We've got to unpack the race neutral, right, kind of under the surface piece or within policy, procedure, and practice, because that's how we're then looking at the data, right? We're seeing where the racial and ethnic disparities exist, or the gender disparities exist, and then really leaning into that. So, we always say, for this work to be successful, your organization's got to find ways to create and dedicate infrastructure. That's financial resources, right? That's the adequate funding resources. That's the adequate human staffing, right? The human capital resources for this. And it's also at the decision-making level as well, right? This needs to be in a space where there's some real decision-making power that exists within this body of work, so that it can actually focus and implement and make recommendations around policy, procedures, and practices. Because again, that's what's driving how you all work daily, right? You all operate within rules, within structures that ultimately determine how you move through an organization. Those things create outcomes, right? And again, we oftentimes see this, right? We see the disparities that exist. That's how we start to focus in and say, hey, this policy is not working the way we intended it to, right? And it might not be something you did, right? But it could be unpacking a policy that has been in place for years. We had a client, right? And part of this is where this is the pushback, being able to look at it and then like ask the question, well, why are we doing this? We had a client who required us to fill out a background check form, right, for our agreement. And the question is why, right? And we know that data tells us that when you have a policy in place like that, that disproportionately impacts, right, people of color. And so if your goal is we want a more diverse and inclusive space, but you're requiring organizations, right, to contractors or whatever else it may be to fill out these forms, there's likely disparate impact. And so how do we then begin to shift that policy? Ask ourselves the question, why do we have this policy in the first place? Is it a mandate? Is it statutory somehow, right, with a legal prerequisite? If it's not, then it's something your organization has the ability to change. And this is why we say this infrastructure is so critical, because it requires dedicated focus, right, and expertise to be able to do that kind of self-accounting, to be able to do that questioning, auditing work within the organization, and asking those questions so that we can be able to identify, again, where we need to start. I'm just seeing Maureen put something in the chat. So organizations have experience with more focus on D&I action and raising awareness looking. Yep. No commitment. Yep. And again, this is why, so Maureen, right, made a great point, right? So organizations where they're just focusing on like D&I, right, and like bias training and things like that, That's great, but that focuses purely on the the interpersonal, the individual. But then the entire time, those policies don't go unchecked, right? And again, the data is going to show you, you all have some areas where you've got disparities, right? That's occurring based on what you're doing. You've got to find the data to be able to identify those areas, right? We're missing the structural changes that allow people, all people, to thrive. And Maureen also talked about, again, like, there's just limited resources, right? We're shortchanging these efforts. And again, how could we possibly be successful if we don't have what we need to be successful, right? We can say that for so many other aspects and areas of our professional development, right? And just in the professional space. But for some reason, this is where, one of those spaces where it seems like, oh, well, why are you asking for more? Like, can't we just do this like on the side? It has to, again, be a critical organizational piece, right? To dismantle it and disrupt it. There are going to be challenges ahead, y'all. I don't, this work is not easy. We say this is forever work. We call ourselves practitioners, not experts, because we're ever learning, right? It's an ever developing and changing field, but it's one of those things where we're mindful of it, right? I said it, accept and expect lack of closure. Some of these challenges that you're going to run to, right? Timing, I think, is everything. This is why I said, depending on where you all are on your journey, what you're hoping to achieve, you've got to be really, really clear about where you are in terms of readiness, right? At any given time in your organization, because that's going to determine how successful you are and what you can get done, right? Organizational readiness. We can't dive in and start tackling white supremacy in an organization, right? That's just not ready to talk about that yet. We've got to be honest to ourselves about where we are and where we're starting, and then use that as the starting point, right? But time and timing is always critical. And then we also have to push back on, we want this done tomorrow, right? We want this done in the next 6 months. It's not going to happen in that time frame, right? It's going to require years, because we're unpacking generations, right, of policy, procedure, and practice that is embedded in structural and institutional racism, right? We're peeling back an onion. That takes time. It's going to be uncomfortable, for many people. And so we've got to lean into that uncomfort. We've got to, because I know, and we've said this too often, right? Much of these efforts, when I say D&I efforts, are to help white people feel better about what is going on in the country to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? That's not the right motivation, right? That is what leads to D&I efforts, which are strictly performative and make people feel better, rather than not changing any of the rules or, right, again, the policy, procedures, and practices that actually guide how we do things and create outcomes. That's the uncomfortable work, because it's calling out that, hey, you've benefited from this policy for so long, and this is why, right, this other group doesn't, right, succeed or thrive. And if we actually want, and you're committed to shifting that, then you've got to have that wrestle, like, where did my privilege come in, and where did I benefit, and where did others burden? And so how do we actually make it so that policy works for all? And we're not always going to get it right. It's one of those things where I think this is, I would say, we strive for excellence, not for perfection. We're going to use the wrong words at time. We're, going to think that we're starting in the right spot, but we're not really. It is iterative work. We've got to constantly be on ourselves, measuring our impact, right? Seeing where we are and how things are going, and be able to make those pivots and adjustments where we need to. And it's okay, because this is work that, has not been happening for a long time, respectively, right? As we think about how long structural and institutional racism has been in place and has been operating, right? We've got to continue to develop each of our own approaches to this work and lean into that. I love this quote by Maya Angelou, right? You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. Which is, again, what we continue to move through as we go through this. And so some of the things I want to kind of hope you leave with and hold in your heads as we go through this, right, is common language and concepts is really critical. If you're leaning into DEI efforts within your organization, you've got to have what we call normalizing efforts. You've got to normalize the language within your organization, right? What does diversity and inclusion mean? What does equity mean for your organization, right? When you're using other words that are connected to that, other concepts, other things, intersectionality, right? What do those things mean? So that, and you have to share that, right, across the organization. because you have to have that shared understanding so that everyone's really clear about how you collectively move forward in those efforts. We say, right, we need to be explicit about race and ethnicity. We have to call it out. It's a practice, it's uncomfortable, but we've got to get comfortable calling it out explicitly. Why? Because it's gonna help us to call out where we're seeing the disparate impacts and outcomes, right? Things work better for certain groups of people, and other groups are being burdened intentionally, right? Because of the ways just our systems and our institutions were designed. We've got to call that out. We've got to be explicit about that. Organizing internally. This is where I would say, like, this work, if you're leading this effort, it can't just be you. You've got to recruit and build, right, community within your organizations to take this on. It really is a collective effort. We believe in collective liberation because it's going to take every single one of us in some way, shape, or form to dismantle, to interrupt those systems, those policies, procedures, and practices so we can create different outcomes. Always, again, I think centering and identifying those most impacted. We do this through the data, right? The infrastructure that we can create within organizations is super critical. We've got to make investment in it if we want this to be successful. It can't just be a one-off initiative. And then focus, again, move away from the interpersonal, right? I also, again, I try to really push organizations to move away from the individual and focus on what the institution, what the organization has control over, right, in those policy, procedures, and practices, because those are going to determine outcomes. Those are going to drive the impact that we're looking to have. And then, listen, I appreciate intent, but I am more concerned about impact, because you could have the greatest intent, right? The road to hell is paved with great intent. And so it's part of this is understanding that, your intent could be in the right place, your heart could be in the right place. But if you're creating harm by changing policies, by doing things in an organization, then you're creating harm, right? We don't want to do that. The impact is what we're hoping for, right? The impact is what we're hoping to change, what we're hoping to create. And so this is where, again, we're pleased, focus on impact. The impact is super critical because people's lives truly do depend on it. And we've seen so much about our mental health and all that. These are some of the critical things that need to happen, and we just need to be aware of as we move through the space. And then these are some of the resources. So we'll have this. When you get this, you'll be able to click the links that are the ones that are highlighted. The White Supremacy Culture and Organizations is the white supremacy resource that I was telling you all about. That helps you identify what some of those tenets and things look like within an organization and provides those antidotes, some really good discussion questions, right, as an organization that I think are a great starting point to help you to unpack and really think about what does it mean for your organization, how it's showing up, and what you can do about it. Again, great resource. And then all these other ones, podcasts, these books, I think are all great places to start depending where you are in your journey, to think about how you lean into this work and how you can continue to grow your knowledge base and learn. So these are just, again, some of the resources. There's many, many more out there, but I think if you click these, you'll find even more, right, from a web standpoint. These will lead to others that I think can be really helpful in your journey. And so that's kind of what I had for you all today, but would love to hear questions or thoughts or comments in these last few minutes. Again, I appreciate the time. And if you ever need to reach out with questions, this is my email. Feel free to send us a note.